Continue. Page 197. Rubin, an investment banker by profession, has been Clinton's first director of the newly created National Economic Council, a White House office designed to coordinate all president's economic policy at the NEC. Rubin had been a staunch advocate of what he described as the Fed's independence. He insisted that no administration official comment on Fed policy, although he writes in his memoir that Clinton always adhered to the principle of keeping presidents out of Fed policy. This wasn't just good economics, it was good politics. Evident respect for the Fed's independence can bolster the president's credibility. Soon the respect for Greenspan became personal. Rubin, together with his deputy Larry Summers, forged a close bond with Greenspan on the tennis courts, at the breakfast table, and importantly on all questions of economic policy. While Rubin and Summers never told Greenspan his business, Greenspan felt comfortable telling them theirs. Their discussions ranged from preparations for meetings with foreign governments responding to international crisis, or just debates about economics generally. These meetings were a cross between a graduate seminar in economics and policy planning meeting, with bits of gossip thrown in. Over time, the three of them, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers, merged into the kind of brotherhood with an easy rapport oriented toward solving economic policy problems and creating financial order that conformed to their economic worldview. As a Time magazine easy put it in famous cover story, there were the Committee to Save the World, three marketeers. What they shared was a common ideology, their faith in the markets and in their own ability to analyze them. As we've seen elsewhere in this book, unbridled faith in markets and economists' ability to analyze them proved fatal in the financial crisis, but for the 1990s it meant that the Federal Reserve and Clinton presidency had almost merged with Greenspan as his own figurehead. As befitted his stature, when Time put the three on the cover of its magazine, Greenspan towered in the front, with his secretary and deputy secretary in the distance behind him. Conclusion: Law and personality with the president. The law and practice in the presidential attempts to control Fed policy demonstrate powerfully one of the book's main themes. Law matters, but the way that we would think from the reading the statute and it is not. Law matters, but the way we would think from just reading the statute and it is not enough to guarantee the balance between political control and technocratic expertise that congressional designers may have sought. This reality is the most obvious in the way that the Fed chair and Fed governor terms have reserved the attempt to balance the democratic accountability and technocratic expertise. The increase of political accountability to the president that four-year term is designed to bring has allowed for empire building among Fed chairs, whereas the apparent liberation of the 14-year term has become a mechanism for exerting presidential control on the Fed. This chapter has also demonstrated how much personality and personnel matter in this determination of Fed policy, not just as at the Federal Reserve but also at the White House. The exact identities of Ulysses, the president, and his chaperone, the Fed chair, matter enormously in determining the shape and the space within which the Fed exercises its extraordinary authority. Chapter 9. Congress and the Fed. Try to get this book to stay up. The Curious Case of the Fed. The Congress and the Fed. The curious case in the Fed's budgetary autonomy. He may make a theory that since we admit and we know that the House of Commons is the real sovereign and any other sovereign is superfluous. I don't know how to pronounce that there. Superfluous. Walter Begot, 1873. When Ben Bernanke was asked in his final press conference as Fed chair about the words of advice for his successor, Janet Yellen, Bernanke responded clearly, "Congress is our boss, with every right to set up the terms on the Fed which the Fed operates. This is true from a constitutional perspective. Congress has the authority to pass all kinds of legislation, including even abolishing the Federal Reserve, without running afoul of the Constitution. Unlike, for example, for the European Central Bank, the Fed enjoys no special constitutional protection. Although not exactly the same as the House of Commons, Congress is, from the Fed's perspective, real sovereign. The history of the Fed makes clear that Congress has indeed been a willing participant in changing the Fed's institutional design in ways both large and small. We have already discussed in detail the Fed's second founding in 1935, a legislative act that redistributed power within the system, created a new committee at the Fed, the Board of Governors, and redefined one that it had created just 2 years before. The Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. Even more often than that, the history of the Fed is a history of Congress passing a long string of new legislation, giving the Fed more and more authority, some of which it did not seek. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 is but the largest example of this expansion. But as this case was with the President and the Fed, the relationship between Congress and the Fed is more complicated and much more interesting than that of the lawgiver creating new, different legal commands. In this chapter, we'll look at two ways Congress concedes and exercise influence over the Fed without actually passing laws: legislative threats and, curiously, an extraordinary acquiescence, I'm not sure, to the Fed's unique budgetary autonomy that Congress never granted by statute. Legislative threats. We have already seen how Congress influences the Fed through active legislation such as Banking Act of 1935, the Bank Holding Company Act of 1956, or the Truth in Lending Act of 1970. A different kind of influence from Congress comes through individual members. Attempts to shape the policy or win points against the constituents with threats of legislation, whether through hearings, introduced legislation, or other mechanisms. Recent scholarships on this phenomenon shows that while Republicans and Democrats differ on their specific policy proposals, legislative threats and counter-cyclical, that's crazy, that word, counter-cyclical, if I pronounce it right. That is, when things are going well, Congress tends to leave the Fed alone. But when the economy tanks, Congress starts paying attention. While it is difficult to determine whether these threats shape the Fed behavior systematically, 2 episodes from the Fed history demonstrate specific instances where congressional threats were indeed decisive on shaping the space within the Fed operates. For decades, the name Wright-Patman would fill Federal Reserve chairs with dread. Patman had, in the words of his political historian Donald Kettle, made his career as the populist scourge of the Fed over the course of his 5 decades. In this House of Representatives, he eventually became Dean of the House. As his longest-serving member, Patman was the Fed's perennial foe. He almost never succeeded in changing the Fed, but with a slew of former legislative proposals, but his unflagging efforts demonstrate how legislative threats were sufficient to shape Fed behavior. A case in point is the Patman hearings in 1964. Using the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the Federal Reserve Act to hold 5 months of hearings on Fed history, structure, and policies, Patman pushed Chair William McChesney Martin into the arms of waiting Lyndon Johnson. The Patman hearings weren't the congressman's first foray in Fed heckling. Patman had significant hearings in 1952 on the questions of the separation of monetary and fiscal policy and the Fed's complicated governance. He was against both. During the Eisenhower years, too, Martin and Patman dueled at virtually every hearing where they both participated, the duels becoming legendary, as Martin's biographer described them. But the 1964 hearings marked something different in character, not least because of their extended attention at times, their seeming popularity with Patman's colleagues. During the hearings, Patman also disclosed his suite of Fed reforms, eliminating the FOMC, increasing the Board of Governors to 12 members, and restoring the Secretary of Treasury to the board. He also wanted to quash the Fed's budgetary autonomy by bringing the Fed under annual congressional appropriations. Normally, Martin would deflect these criticisms through his network of congressional and market contacts. He frequently used his political skills to take the wind out of the criticisms of the Fed. But although the minority Republicans in the House did not share Patman's zeal, Patman's appeals were gaining traction with his fellow Democrats after the 1962 election. Democrats held a 258-176 majority, and electoral prospects of a few months ahead were looking increasingly rosy. Martin realized that the only source for his and the Fed's salvation was another Texan. The new president, Patman and Johnson, went back along the way. The older Patman and served in the Texas state legislature with Johnson's father and with Johnson himself for a decade in the U.S. House. But Johnson and Martin were then in the midst of their tussle over interest rates and economic policy, described in Chapter 2. Martin worried that appealing to the president would result in some sense of obligation for the Fed chair, especially when the president was Lyndon Johnson's justly famed for his preference and skill at political horse trading. These concerns notwithstanding, Martin made the appointment with Johnson to express his concerns about the 1964 Patman hearings and quickly received the LBJ treatment. A long walk around the White House grounds in full view of the press with LBJ's heavy arm draped over the shorter man's shoulders. The conversation started on Johnson's terms with the discussion of interest rates. Martin reiterated his inflationary fear and desire to push the interest rates in the short term. Johnson's response was almost playful. Now I have some pretty good people here, and they don't agree with you, but we'll talk about it later. The men then turned to Patman's hearings. Johnson's listened to Martin's concerns without comment. But when they returned to the Oval Office, Johnson called the Speaker House John McCormick in Patman's presence to resolve the issue. 2 weeks later, after 5 months of hearings that seemed headed for significant reform, the hearings ended without legislation. In the final years of the Johnson administration, Martin's resolute stand against inflation started to ebb. Although he remained committed to speaking out against the problems of deficit spending without limit, he was not successful at leading the Fed against the administration's desires to have an easier monetary policy to support its domestic, the Great Society, and international, the Vietnam War agendas. Did Martin's failure come from his use of the president as a strategic partner against Patman? It's difficult to know with certainty. One would expect, as Johnson himself did, that a bureaucrat whose job was effectively spread by the president would owe LBJ some quo for the presidential quid. Martin was sensitive to those demands, and continued to needle the Johnson administration at the margins, primarily through the discount rate. At one point, because of the obvious conflicts, Martin offered his resignation. If President Johnson wanted a different Fed chair who would support administration policies, he would have him. Johnson rejected the offer, but almost immediately regretted it after Martin compared the 1965 financial climate with that of the pre-crash from 1929. But while Martin maintained his distance in the short term, there is also evidence that he began a conciliatory side against the president during the end of the Johnson administration, including by almost constant coordination of monetary policy and fiscal policy. This very proximity and the coordination is, in Meltzer's view, one of the most significant errors in Martin's final years in office, that Martin felt compelled, at the very least, to coordinate these policies with the harms that this kind of coordination brought, came from the same impulse that led him to seek and receive protection against the legislation threats of Wright Patman. Patman, of course, never succeeded at changing the Fed to the full extent that he had hoped, in part because of the sense that he was so extreme he couldn't build a strong consensus, but he succeeded at keeping Fed reform as a perennial topic of conversation, and likely succeeded in pushing the Fed into the arms of an eager President precisely what Patman wanted to do. He is a strong example of congressional influence outside of pure lawmaking. Henry Gonzalez and the birth of the Federal Reserve transparency. Henry Gonzalez was a member of Congress most active in the Fed oversight during the 1990s. Gonzalez was in tradition of Wright Patman, a Texas populist suspicious of the Fed's power, secrecy, and proximity to private bankers in New York. But his proposed changes to the Fed were more anchored around transparency in the form of pure sunlight, letting the public see how the FOMC made decisions by putting cameras inside the FOMC meetings and releasing the video on a 60-day delay. Gonzalez introduced legislation to the end, which Greenspan adamantly opposed. He thought the idea of making the deliberations within the FOMC publicly available would turn these meetings into a series of bland, written presentations. In the case, the advantages to the policy formulation of unfettered debate would be lost. The Fed had a history with selective disclosure of what transpired in the FOMC meetings. The Board of Governors had distributed summaries of the FOMC decisions in the Board of Annual Reports, but also prepared much more detailed memoranda of discussion, MOD, which were something between detailed minutes and verbatim transcripts. The effort to control the production and distribution of the memoranda was a source of tension between the Fed and the Congress before. Patman had demanded the full verbatim transcripts for the early 1960s at the time when Friedman and Schwartz, damning history of the Fed's role in exacerbating, God, that fucking word, exacerbating, that's how it's pronounced. So, the Great Depression was published. Patman's committee received those transcripts, and shortly thereafter the Fed started releasing these MODs, but not the full transcripts on a 5-year lag. In 1974, Patman asked for more transcripts. Fed Chair Arthur Burns said there were none to give. There were transcripts once, but they were only used to create the MODs once the FOMC minutes were prepared. The transcripts were routinely disposed of when they served their purpose. The Fed's retreat into secrecy went even further 2 years later in response to the new government and the Sunshine Act. The Fed became the target of lawsuits and pressure to disclose more about its internal deliberations, and so the Fed closed up shop on the distribution of the memoranda of discussions by a 10-1 vote. Patman, as one would expect, was livid with these decisions. Here Burns showed himself adept at controlling the fallout. While refusing to restore the memoranda again, he proposed a compromise. The FOMC would publicly release what is called Minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee on a 90-day lag. These minutes were hardly that. They contained a summary of the action taken, but no comments for attribution. The only time an individual FOMC member was singled out was if he dissented, and even the minutes didn't explain the reason for the dissent. These minutes did the trick, though, and the dust up over the Fed transparency subsided. Burns, however, had a secret. What no one on the outside the Fed and almost no one on inside the Fed knew was that Burns had kept the transcripts going, a practice continued by Greenspan. The FOMC meetings were recorded without members' knowledge, and transcripts were still being prepared for the chair's personal use. During the course of what came to be called the Gonzalez hearings, the truth about the still available transcripts came out. The Fed staff kept under lock and key the full transcripts of these meetings. When Gonzalez learned the existence of these transcripts, he changed tacks away from trying to get these meetings televised and toward releasing the transcripts. He threatened to subpoena them if the Fed did not agree to their release. Greenspan permitted 2 lawyers from the House Banking Committee, one Republican, one Democrat, to listen to most recent tapes. The Fed also decided for the first time in its history to announce publicly the specific policy intention that the FOMC had reached during each meeting, and to release transcripts of the meeting on a 5-year lag. Today, these lagged releases are a centerpiece of the Fed's public engagement. One famous British central banker, Montagu Norman, once summed up his philosophy on central bank transparency: never explain, never apologize. This all changed in the 1990s. Some credit Alan Greenspan for those changes, but the full text of the FOMC transcripts came into public domain shows a different story. One of the most significant changes in the practice of central banking occurred not because of the chair leadership, but legislative threats from a congressman whose legislative agenda never got close to enactment. Budgetary autonomy, statutory evolution, and congressional acquiescence. If legislative threats show members of Congress making efforts to hold the Fed to account, the next topic shows deep and long-standing congressional acquiescence, one of the primary means of congressional control over governmental agencies and the power of the purse, or the ability to fund or defund the relevant agency. This power represents a unique and often misconstrued aspect of the Congress's relationship with the Fed. The Fed, unlike other agencies, is unable to fund itself from the proceeds of open market operation that it controls. With very limited interference from the political branches, Congress has conceded this most powerful tool completely. This budgetary autonomy is not misconstrued because it is secret. To the contrary, the Fed includes on its own website and in its detailed annual reports a frank admission that the system's income primarily from the interest on government securities that it is acquired through open market operation. Instead, the Fed's budgetary autonomy is misunderstood because few know where this authority comes from. The bottom line is this: when Congress removed the Fed from the annual appropriations process, as it has done with several agencies through history, it has almost imposed strict statutory limits on how the Fed could generate these non-appropriated funds. One by one, those limits have disappeared, but not through legislative annulment. Time and changing circumstances have intervened. The law of the Fed's limited budgetary autonomy remains on the books. The practice of the Fed's unlimited budgetary autonomy is very different. Funding the government. There are 4 forms of funding the government. First, the vast majority of governmental institutions, from Congress to the courts to the White House and most agencies, institutions, programs, and commissions in between, are funded through Congress's annual appropriations process. That is, the President proposes his budget to Congress based presumably on inputs from those agencies who require the funding. Political machinations ensue, and a budget is passed funding the government. The process begins a year later. Second, the majority of actual governmental expenditures does not occur through the appropriation process, but instead is part of the government's mandatory commitments. These commitments include entitlement programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other forms of direct assistance, some kinds of disaster relief, and the interest on the national debt. And third, some governmental agencies, include some of the banking agencies, are self-funded, meaning that they raise money by assessing fees against the entities that regulate. For example, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, the agency in charge of ensuring the nation's banking deposits, charges bank fees for that insurance. From those fees, the FDIC is not the only covers losses to the insurance fund, but also covers its expenses. This new Office for Financial Research, OFR, an agency set up by the Dodd-Frank Act to provide the Treasury with research on financial stability, is funded by an assessment on members of the financial industry. And then there is the Fed. Like the FDIC or OFR, the Fed is self-funded, in that it is not part of the annual appropriations process, nor is it a mandatory commitment. But unlike the FDIC, most of its budget doesn't come from the assessments against regulated entities. Instead, the Fed funds itself with a portion of the proceeds from its open market operation. As the Fed reported in its 2013 budget report, the major sources of income were interest earnings from the portfolio of the U.S. government securities, $49 billion, and the federal agency mortgage-backed securities, MBS, is $31.4 billion. In the system open market account, earnings in the excess of expensive dividends and surplus are transferred to the U.S. Treasury in 2012, a total of $88.4 billion, that the Fed funds itself largely from the proceeds of its substantial assets, taken together with the nature of the Fed's ability to create money in pursuit of its monetary policy. Objectives means that the Fed's funding is unique in government. As we have seen, the Fed conducts monetary policy by, among other options, creating money with which it can buy government, and more recently non-government securities. These interest-bearing assets generate money that the agency can subsequently use to fund itself. The Fed thus has the ability to create from nothing the money it eventually uses to pay its employees, fund its conferences, and renovate its buildings. The Fed's budgetary autonomy is thus without equal in the federal government. But there is the striking reality: it is not expressly authorized by Congress. Instead, Congress creates the Fed to look more like the FDIC. The Federal Reserve's funding mechanism is located in Section 10, parentheses 3 of the Federal Reserve Act. The section grants the Board of Governors the power to levy semi-annually upon the Federal Reserve banks an assessment sufficient to pay its estimated expenses and salaries of its members, and employees for the half year succeeding the levying of such assessment. Unquestionably, this statutory authorization exempts the Fed from the congressional appropriations on its face. However, it just looks like the Fed was given the same status as the FDIC. The ability to charge essentially private institutions for its own upkeep. The statute does not allow the Fed to create and fund itself with its own Federal Reserve notes. The rise of Fed budgetary autonomy. How then did this relatively modest statutory authorization metamorphose instead of metamorphosized? I don't know. Into the Fed's complete budgetary autonomy? 3 historical changes made the difference. The end of the budgetary autonomy of the reserve banks terminated in 1935. The Fed's history with what was called the Real Bills Doctrine, and the Fed's history with the gold standard. Chapter 1 explained in detail the rise and the fall of the autonomous Federal Reserve banks. The autonomy was key to making sense of the Congress's funding apparatus for the Federal Reserve System. With autonomous Federal Reserve banks, the system had to battle for scarce resources just like any other participant in the market economy. And during the period of the Reserve Bank autonomy, the banks were mindful of managing their earnings in ways that increased conflict between the Federal Reserve Board and the reserve banks. Even though the Federal Reserve Board participated to a limited extent in shaping the tenor of monetary policy. The reality is that the Federal Reserve banks could and did pursue their own monetary policy. As a result, there existed a separation between the assessment authority, which resided with the Federal Reserve Board, and the operations authority, which resided with the Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve Board, in its early stage, could not create the money with which it funded itself. It had to get that money from the reserve banks. Nice. The separation, of course, has disappeared. The statutory funding mechanism has not kept pace with the U.S. central banking practice. The era of autonomy for the reserve banks ended with the passage of the Banking Act of 1935, which placed the authority for open market operations of the individual banks in the Washington-based board. The assessment provision, however, was unchanged by itself. That abolition of the Reserve Bank's autonomy isn't enough to show much distance between the Fed's budgetary autonomy today and its more limited budgetary autonomy in history. After all, if the Federal Reserve banks could create the money with which to fund themselves, then making the Federal Reserve Board beg them for money would only tell us that the location of this extraordinary authority shifted within the Federal Reserve System. Two changes to the practice of monetary policy show how different the funding mechanism has become. No matter where within the system that authority is located, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the idea of the fiat currency, or a currency not backed by gold or some other fixed exchange, was anathema to the system's legislative sponsor. To combat the temptation to prevailing monetary doctrines kept the reserve banks from printing money. The gold standard and what would become to be called the real bills doctrine in 1913. The Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The industrial world was at what we would turn out to be the end of the classic gold standard. Under his gold standard, gold was the legal tender of international commerce. National money, the U.S. dollar, the British pound, was issued against gold, meaning that paper money could be redeemed for gold. Although the regulatory requirements of the conversion varied from country to country, governments that had committed themselves to the standard did not have complete discretion in determining the value of their currency. Begot referred to it not as the gold standard but the cast iron system because it locked the countries